Hello, I'm Dr. Winston York. I'm a software engineer, but I've also long been fascinated by voting systems. And this fall, where I live, British Columbia is holding a referendum on whether or not to switch to proportional representation from first past the post. I'm making this series of videos to help voters, particularly those who, like myself, are politically conservative, make an informed decision about how to vote in this important referendum. Most people would see the current British Columbia political landscape as a progressive vote split between the NDP and the Greens. As such, progressives tend to support proportional representation because they think the current system is defying the will of the people by not electing a progressive government. Conservatives, on the other hand, are inclined to keep the current system, first past the post, because they think they're being helped out by this vote split between the progressive parties. In my view, however, there isn't actually a progressive vote split. That is, thinking of the NDP Greens as being engaged in some sort of vote split for progressive voters is really not the right way of looking at this. Now, I realize that sounds like a bit of a strange claim, but hear me out. The first thing is that the idea of a progressive vote split makes an assumption about how voters operate, which is not true. It assumes that voters actually operate on a consistent political ideology. Now, this is hard for those of us who have confirmed political ideologies to accept. But many voters are not simply choosing a party which has policy and ideology closest to them. People instead vote for any number of different reasons. Now, we can see an illustration of this by looking at the federal vote in BC. So this is BC's vote in federal elections since 1980, looking at the popular vote just in BC. But rather than at provincial elections, this is federal elections. And I want to draw your attention in particular to the time period between 1993 and 2000, when the Reform Party or Canadian Alliance was active. And as you might expect, the Progressive Conservative vote is low during this period, which is pretty intuitive. But what's less intuitive is the fact that the NDP vote is also low during this period. The NDP had been getting 35% of the vote in the few elections prior to the Reform being active, but once Reform is active, the NDP is reduced to around 20% of the vote. What's going on? This doesn't make any sense. The NDP is the leftmost party, and the Reform Party was the rightmost party, but the data seems to suggest that NDP voters went and voted Reform. The most plausible account of this is that this vote is not so much an endorsement of either the Reform or NDP policies, as much as it is as a protest against the major parties and perhaps a feeling of Western alienation. And indeed, you will see the same pattern take place in any of the Western provinces. It is problematic to think that just because a voter voted for a progressive party in one election, that they will continue voting for progressive parties or that they would support other progressive parties as a second choice. The biggest reason to think that there isn't a progressive vote split in British Columbia is that Green voters don't act like they're on a vote split. If we look back through BC history at episodes of vote splitting, such as 1972, 1991, and 1996, when we did have vote splits in British Columbia, voters very dramatically shifted in response to that vote split to put a different party in power. The fact is, people don't like not being in power because of a split in the vote, and they will dramatically shift who they vote for to rectify that situation. The Greens have not. The Green vote has maintained its status since 2005. And likewise, the NDP vote hasn't budged. There's no sign that Green voters are switching over to the NDP. And I think if it were a vote split, that's what we would be seeing. But we don't. Furthermore, the Green vote doesn't come at the expense of the NDP. If it were a vote split, what you'd expect is that the NDP lost a bunch of their percentage of the vote. But the NDP percentage of the vote has been 40% since 1972 and shows no sign of changing. It's in fact the most consistent aspect of BC politics. Indeed, in the most recent election, you can see that the Green vote is up, but it comes not at the cost of the NDP, but rather of the Liberals and the Conservatives. Furthermore, to interpret this as a vote split, you have to believe some strange swings are going on in BC politics. You have to believe that BC swung way more progressive between 2001 and 2005, and that it swung conservative in 2013 when the Conservatives did especially well, and then it swung way progressive in 2017. I don't think British Columbians are swinging over the political spectrum like that. I think British Columbians simply aren't voting in an ideological fashion. Many voters are taking into account other factors, and I think in particular in the most recent election, a desire to throw the Liberals out of office over and against any particular endorsement of Green policy or ideology. what we're seeing in the Green vote isn't a reflection of progressive policy desires. Rather, it seems, if you look across the scope of BC history, it's a reflection of what we see throughout BC history. People want to vote for a third party. There's some fraction of the population who's always inclined to vote not either for the governing party or for the main opposition, but for somebody else. The third party of choice has changed over time. It's been the Liberals, it's been the Conservatives, it's been the Reform Party, it's been the Progressive Democratic Alliance. In most recent elections, it's been the Conservatives or the Greens. The fact is, if you're voting for a third party, it means that you may not want to support the government, but you're actually not willing to support the party that's going to unseat the government either. And it's really closer perhaps to an abstention, not willing to either support or bring down the government of the day, than it is an endorsement of any particular policy or ideology. All of this means that it's a mistake to think that there's a progressive majority in British Columbia who are being kept out of power by a vote split. The fact is, if that was what it was, the vote split would be resolved. But all the indications are that the situation is not that simple. People are not simply voting for progressive parties and are too stupid to figure out how all to vote for the same progressive party. As a consequence, it's wrong to conclude that the political will of the people is being thwarted by the governments that have been elected in BC. And it's also wrong to conclude that under a proportional system that we would elect progressive governments. Now, who will we actually elect under a proportional system? That's a question we're going to have to look much further into next time.